just for those that are joining in, we, at the start of this outreach process, we let everyone know that we would be putting the recorded comments in the actual Zoom linked on the website. As a matter of fact, that webpage, I just went ahead and popped it in the chat for folks, and we'll probably do that a few times throughout the time we have together. Part of the reason that we put these meetings, and good evening, Jim. Part of the reason that we put these up on the website is we want people, even if you can't attend, maybe you have neighbors or colleagues or friends that want to have the information. And so we really want to make sure that folks just have a consistent opportunity to share, to engage, and to have a way to really participate in their community. So we're going to give it just another minute or two, give folks a chance to join. Sometimes we've had 80, 90 people, sometimes we've had a few. I think our pledge as a community is to make sure that if you take the time to give up your evening to come get some information and share your thoughts, that we're here for you. So we're going to do that. And we're joined by Mayor Sam Liccardo and several members of our city staff. And so we'll get cracking here in just a couple minutes. I'm just going to go on mute one quick second. Well, I tell you what, out of respect for Mr. Franklin, Jessica, and Mr. Brown, I think I'd be inclined to go ahead and get started. This will be recorded,
Yeah.
so the other folks will be able to hear. Just to reintroduce myself for you, Omar Passons. I'm a deputy city manager with the city of San Jose. I joined in June and am really looking forward to helping support this community and providing leadership around some of these issues. And we'll talk more about that. I'm joined by Jim Ortball, a former deputy city manager, longtime member of the city team, who has been leading the production aspects of helping us get these emergency homes built and all of the process involved. And then Jill McCaffrey on our team as well is here to make sure it's really, really important that all of your feedback is condensed in a way that we have a handle on it, and then we can provide it to the mayor and council so that they know what folks had to say, what those impressions were. What I'd like to do now is just turn it over to our mayor, Sam Liccardo, to say a few words, and then we'll have a short presentation, and then we'll get into Q&A.
Hey, thank you, Omar, and thanks to community members who decided to get engaged today. We've had a lot of engagement on this issue over multiple public convenings, and I think it may well be the case that we're now, I think in this third formal public meeting, we may have exhausted the community with these. And so I suppose in some ways that's a good sign. Everyone is at least getting heard. I'd like to dispense of any formal speeches since I think we have a pretty intimate gathering here. And I'm happy just to hang around for a conversation, Q&A with folks who are here who'd like to really brew in on their specific concerns or questions. But I want to thank you, Omar, and thank Jill and Jim for all your hard work in this, and particularly in this outreach effort.
Absolutely. Thank you, Mr. Mayor. And so we're just going to jump right in, and just to level set for folks again, there's a couple things. One, sometimes we in the sort of civil service staff can spend a whole lot of time talking at you and not as much time listening. And so what we really did is kind of flip that a little bit. And so we have 90 minutes together, and we're only going to spend about 10 or 12 of those with listening to me. And then we're going to go into a back and forth, and you can ask questions. If you have alternative sites, one of the Mayor Council's directions to us was to take in alternative site locations in the community, and so we want to make that possible as well. And we even set up a site on our webpage to do that. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen right now, and we're going to jump right in as soon as I figure out which of these it is. Let's see here. So it should be the case that you are looking at. Oops, that's not right. That you're looking at a worker in San Jose helping an individual who is unhoused in San Jose. Does that everybody see that sort of screen? Let's see, I see nods. Perfect. So one of the things that we've started all of these sessions with is just to say we understand the frustration of wanting to have been engaged earlier, wanting to be part of the process and notified earlier. There are a lot of reasons and factors, and I would just say that for our team, like, we apologize that didn't happen, and are just really grateful to be able to start from here, gather the information that we need, and keep moving forward. And so we'll spend most of our time, like I said, listening to you, but I just wanted to have mentioned that. And then as we get into this, it's really important to understand what the actual purpose of these sessions is. And there are three real important things. We want to inform, we want to engage, and we want to notify. And what do we really mean by that, right? So there's a whole lot of background information, and we're not going to, like I said, it's only about 10 minutes, so we're not going to give you everything under the sun, but there's a crisis in our community that our mayor and council, our elected leaders, have really stepped forward to address. We want to make sure you understand just the basics so that we have a common language. And then we'll spend most of our time today together engaging, just having an opportunity for you to ask questions, maybe get things clarified that you don't understand or don't know, offer alternative sites. We'll do that most of the time. And then just to notify, we want you to know when your next opportunities to participate will be, both publicly and these other meetings that we have coming. So with that in mind, we're sort of gonna move through a couple of really important pieces. It's useful to know what the scope of the crisis is so that you really have a handle of why we're even doing this. And so we want to start there. We want to help you understand the sort of actions of our elected leaders that have driven our decision-making and implementing their vision. And then the site selection process and what is even an emergency interim home. So just to have a kind of sense there. Also, as I mentioned, getting your perspectives and solutions will really be helpful for us. Even in the process so far, we've done 5 of these sessions. We've had several good pieces of feedback from simple things like, hey, it would be helpful if you put a map on the back of the flyer when you do outreach, right? Because we literally hand delivered hundreds of flyers to people's homes. But that was a good piece of feedback. So we really do sort of learn from this exchange. And then also, as I said, the sort of what happens next. So where do we start? I put this slide up that demonstrates that there are at least 5,031 people actually living on the street in the city of San Jose. For those that are familiar with the way these counts happen, there's more total people, but these emergency interim housing communities are designed to help people get off the street. So we wanted you to know how many people are on the street. And that's just as of a count that happened in February of this year. That's an awful lot of folks that our elected leadership has decided together with our city government, we want to do something about. And I would say it's really useful for folks to know that although that's a very large number, the number of people who are living outside, who are unsheltered, homeless, has gone down in San Jose, in part because of efforts just like this one. So it really is important to do. One of the questions that we get a lot is there even a plan? What's going on? What are you just making this up? And so we always want to share people. There is a a community plan that was adopted across the entire Santa Clara County by cities throughout the region, including the city of San Jose, the members of the business community, nonprofit sector, a large array of folks all signed on to this coordinated community plan. And for those that are just joining, again, just a reminder, we're only going to do this. There's about 7 more minutes of sort of background, and then we'll really get into the engagement. We just want to make sure folks have a common understanding before we get going. So, and again, my name is Omar Passons. I'm a deputy city manager with the city of San Jose. So there are these 3 strategies. And if you look at the first 2 strategies, they're really about prevention, right? Homelessness, the root causes of homelessness, the things that stop people even before they get to crisis, right? That's a preventive approach. That second category, expanding homelessness prevention. Our elected leaders have actually added resources so that when that point of crisis is here, we are participating in preventing people. And you'll see on the next slide that over 2,000 people have been helped from ever even getting into homelessness. And that third strategy, and this is what we're going to spend most of our time on tonight together, improving quality of life for unsheltered individuals. And I really want to underline that, create healthy neighborhoods for all San Jose residents. In our case, right, we're the city of San Jose. So it's both quality of life for people who are living on the street and creating healthy neighborhoods for all. And I want to say, as you look at this next slide, it's a little hard to see. And it's okay, because we did that so that you could see it on the website. You can actually download the whole slide deck. But we wanted you to know, like, almost 6,000 people permanently housed, couple thousand, over 2,000 people prevented from experiencing homelessness. Those are really important numbers, even though as we all look around, when we drive or walk or bike or whatever it is, there's still a massive crisis. And so there's still a lot of work to do. And that's part of the reason that we're here today. So how did we get here? In 2017, the city council directed an initial sort of search and site to begin the process of site development. That direction was for all 10 council districts. It is a shared responsibility. And then this year in June, the mayor council added some additional clarity. It said, hey, or an additional direction, I should say. Here are some sites, 4 sites that you can move forward with on the design and development. And at the same time, alternatively, it said, you can look for alternative sites. And if you can find alternative sites together with the community and others in the same communities, you can go forward with those. And so we've been moving forward on both of those directions. And as I mentioned, not when I said it was a shared responsibility, 8 of our 10 council districts currently either have an active, either bridge housing community or emergency interim community, or they have a proposed one. So it really is trying to make this something that we share as a community. One of the questions that we have gotten, and so we wanted to respond to, is what changed about the Noble site, right? There's one of the areas in District 4. And where we started back in 2017 was there wasn't a prohibition near residences or schools. There was actually a scoring factor criteria so that it would impact the scoring of a given site. But then again, what changed, right, in the time since then? A few things have changed. One, our homelessness crisis has worsened, and so there's this greater urgency. 2, our mayor and council, frankly, have said, look, we need to do rapid site identification. We need to get to the point of construction. And just as a reminder for folks that are just kind of joining in, we're getting close here to the end where we're going to pivot to your questions and answers. We're just providing a little bit of background. And I want to say, actually, in terms of the context of informing, these are pictures from our community in San Jose, and they're hard to look at. And it's bad for the person who's living outside, who is living in these conditions. It's bad for the neighbors. It's not a healthy neighborhood for all. It's not a trauma-informed opportunity. It's not something that any of us want for the people who are living in these situations. It's not something that we want for any of us in any neighborhood. And so part of what we're really doing, part of when you call your council office or you're trying to address these issues, is you say, I want this person to get help. I want my neighborhood to look differently than this. And so part of what we're trying to do is to go from that to these. These are actual sites. These are not staged. You can see a couple of bikes because there are people currently using them. These sort of quick build emergency homes provide they improve life for the people who need help, and they improve life for the communities at the same time. And so what I want to do just briefly, because we can't get up from where we are and go take a tour of one of the current sites. This is a site that Jim and I have visited personally in the last month, and I just want to show this 40-second clip. So you can see that there's thought given to the construction and spacing. We'll talk a little bit about the sort of services that get provided very briefly. As I said, we've been to this site. It's got a laundry and multi-use room. It connects people to services. And so as you look, you can see sort of in the background not only some seating, but some raised planters. And we're really pleased with what people who go from those other circumstances that we showed earlier to be able to do this, to be able to live in this space as a transition to permanent housing. It really makes a difference. So just two last slides, and then we'll get to your questions and answers. I said I would keep it pretty short. It's important to know that there's a range of services. Professional site management. This is not, there are people that are contracted to make sure that it's secure, to make sure that it's safe. We have good, solid relationships with those contractors. For many people, their pets are the most important individual in their lives. That's true whether you have a house or you don't. And so one of the things that our folks have been really careful to do is make sure that people can get support for their pets, and it helps them choose to come inside. And the last thing that I'll say is that we really want to focus on making sure that we get clean, safe, secure, and supportive spaces. So that cleanliness is not just the site, it's making sure the site and the area around it remains clean. It's safe. It's about making sure we have close relationships with our brethren and sisterin and everyone who works for the San Jose Police Department to make sure that they are able to respond according to the severity and risk. That these sites are secure. We are not seeing that encampments are coming to these locations that are being created. And finally, that they're supportive. Again, the goal here is for people to get that additional next step. So what I'm going to do is stop sharing. I will say one note about the site selection. I'm going to stop sharing the screen for a minute so we can just chat. On our website, which we put in the chat, there's a link to over 140 sites that the team already looked at. They did a deep dive across all of San Jose, trying to find sites that would work. And there's lots of reasons why they don't from time to time. So we wanted to put that publicly so it was easy for you to get. There's an alternative site form on there, and all we ask you for is it big enough that we can work with, eyeballing it? Is it flat? Do we have the control as the city? Because it makes it easier for us to move forward, or can we get it? And is it accessible from a public street? We're not trying to turn community members into real estate experts if that's not your job. So we didn't put all the criteria or all the guidelines. We did put them on the website though. So if you want to know how we're evaluating, you can find that too. So in any case, I'm going to stop the share. First, I'm going to ask, Jim, is there anything that you wanted to add to cover before we start engaging the people who are here?
No, Omar, I think you covered it well. Thank you.
And then, Mr. Mayor, before I just start asking the community, I just figured I'd check and see if there's anything you wanted to add.
No, I think I'm just happy to engage in conversation. Thanks.
Okay, great. So because this is a smaller group, I don't think we need all of the formalities. If you want to use the hand raise feature, which is on the bottom by where it says reactions, that may work if you have a question. Essentially, there are a couple of things that we'd like to hear. Frankly, any issues or questions or thoughts that you have that you want to raise, we'll take those as they are. And our pledge to you is if we know the answer, we'll answer it. And if we don't know the answer, we'll just tell you that and we'll go get it. So we want people to have the opportunity. And Brian, I see you went off mute, so maybe we'll start with you.
All right. Sure. So I could probably take up the next hour and a half. I'll try not to do that, but so I'm going to start with I just recently found about EIH, and I want to applaud Sam and the council for initiating this. I think it's long overdue, and so I'm here to learn. And I want to start by just the basics, the easy part, I think, and it's just the definition of the EIH. I can springboard into tons of questions from there, but the emergency interim housing, I think, kind of explains what it is, but I want to make sure I'm in sync with your thoughts and the label here. So start with the interim. I'm assuming that's the interim for the tenant or the in-house that's going to go in this spot. It's just a landing place. They're there 6 or 12 months. Is the time frame right? And then what about the location itself? Because my understanding is that these locations are coming from the city council, VTA, wherever. You guys are going to have control of it. Are they staying there indefinitely until the unhoused issue is relieved? Or so what's the longevity of the site, and what's the tenant or the unhoused? How long are they staying there?
Brian, I'm going to ask Jim to
Start
come
with
off mute. As I mentioned, he's been leading the production effort, and so Jim, did you want to chime in on this one?
Sure. Thanks, Brian, for the question. So it really means both. I mean, what is emergency interim housing? It's certainly a response to our declared shelter crisis. So the Mayor and City Council have declared a shelter crisis in our city, which requires us to act to try and create more shelter, more interim housing within our city to address the crisis and to do it as urgently as we can. So that's kind of the emergency circumstance that's declared. Interim applies to both the people that live there, and that it's bridge housing, it's transitional housing, transitional shelter, where people a lot of times will come in off the street. Hopefully it's a stabilizing situation for them, that they get a roof over their head. In these emergency interim housing sites, they have privacy. They can lock the door. In our newer ones, they have a private bathroom, sink, and shower, so that they truly can kind of get prepared for the day with those types of amenities. And the idea is, once they stabilize, maybe in a 3 to 6 to 12 month period, hopefully we can get them permanent housing, whether that's going back with family, whether it's finding an apartment, whether it's getting into affordable housing, or any number of options that our housing department in the city work on, or through the county as well, or nonprofits. So there are a variety of different efforts to have people transition over kind of months, hopefully not more than a year. I'm sure some people have been in longer than a year, that it's just more difficult to do it, but that's generally our goal. And interim also applies to the site itself. They're not intended to be permanent. The legislation and the council direction is ultimately, they wouldn't stay there forever. We're certainly building them with enough quality that they can last many years, so the investment will be good to use for many years, but they aren't built into permanent foundations, and they can be picked up and moved to an alternate location if we need to, or there's a reason for doing that and that type of thing. But that's kind of how interim applies to the
Thanks,
people transitioning through, and to the site and the facilities themselves.
Thanks, Jim. And I want to add for Brian and others that are here. I put the link to the frequently asked questions that our housing department and others in the city government put together, so that folks had an easy access for some of these questions. If you're wondering about this later on and you want to circle back, but so that's it. That's the idea. And again, for everyone, the goal, we're really trying to get people in, get them in off the street, provide them the safety and security of a door they can lock, a bathroom they can use, and then help them get to that permanent home with the support that they need. Brian, let me I'm scanning the room. I'm not seeing any other hands. So for now, I think if you have another one, go for it.
Absolutely. So with the for clarification for that, the location itself, there's not necessarily a time frame associated with it. It could be 2 years, it could be 10 years, as long as everything's going well and working well, quote unquote, and accepted by the community, they can stay there. It sounds like there's no necessarily time frame associated with it, but is that fair? I mean,
Yeah, I think that's fair, Brian. We don't have an end date. There is an end date on state legislation and the use of these, this kind of construction, although that legislation tends to get renewed. So, but we know, I think as Jim mentioned, these are movable. We recognize circumstances may change. We may have new opportunities in other sites. The existing site maybe, for example, we've got a non, the most recent model that we have is Jim described, was really the private bathrooms and private units, but we had an earlier set of models that were on a VTA site that ultimately is going to get used for BART construction. Well, when construction comes, we'll be moving.
Yeah.
And Brian, before I go, hang on, sorry, 1 second. I noticed that Jack did put his hand up, so I want to give him a chance, but I will just say also, just bear in mind, so the federal government has its own definitions of interim as well, where you end up in that a slightly longer window of time. So sometimes it will depend on the funding source for the people. I think the mayor got the structures right. They can be moved and that sort of thing. The people, it may depend on some of the Jack, I hope you don't mind me using your first name. I'll go ahead and unmute you and please feel free to ask your question.
Okay. I have all the concerns that everybody has already mentioned over the last month or so. I won't get into those, but a couple that haven't been addressed. What is the maximum occupancy that you foresee at the fullest that this site would be? And how many parking spaces do you envision putting for these people? Would be just two of my questions.
So, Jack, just for clarity, so that we know, there are a few sites that are under consideration.
Oh, Noble, I'm sorry.
Okay, and so I'm going to ask Jim to answer, and I will just reiterate that there is the site that we are looking at in terms of the design pieces, but also if there are alternatives in your community that are in your same council district, we would love to hear about those as well and keep track. But Jim, did you want to try to answer the question?
Yeah. Thanks for the question, Jack. The direction that we got from the mayor and council was to try and complete out maybe this first round of emergency interim housing development where we get a community in each of the 10 council districts. So we were directed to find 6 sites and then up to about 600 more units or beds for people to stay in, sleep in, and get off the street. So that's kind of the broad direction that we got. And so we've been searching diligently across the city, primarily in 6 council districts. And District 4 is one of them. And the Noble kind of proposed plan site is in District 4. The way we laid out getting to the number of units, for Noble, we were anticipating getting to about 100 units, 100 beds. We don't know precisely, whether there might be more beds in a particular unit, because it could be a facility that could support families. It could be for seniors or women or that type of thing. It could be for singles as well. So we haven't gotten to a place of designing it specifically, but from a capacity standpoint, we're looking to get, about 100 people off the street and, into the interim housing situation. And so we think, given the acreage, the layout of the site, that we can get to a capacity for 100 people. And then as we would move from layout, looking at capacity, into real design and specific design, we'll start taking into account a number of factors. Who is it for? What's the best design for those people? How many parking spaces we need, or how many can we accommodate and try and make the best use of the site? How are we dealing with kind of buffers with adjacent land uses and those types of things? how do we maintain access to the trails and the percolation basins and the Penitentiary Creek area. So a lot of those factors would go into how we would initially preliminarily lay it out and then ultimately design. So, a little bit of a long answer to your question. I would say up to about 100, and then parking kind of, I don't know that we have a number in mind yet. We would need to see what we could fit and what's the right balance. So that's where we're at in the process.
And Jack, I would add one of the challenges on the parking front, just to as students dialing that in, is borne out when you think about sort of senior housing complexes. Oftentimes the number of seniors who actually are still driving when you get into 70s and 80s, for people who are formerly unhoused, those numbers who have a car come way down. And so it'll depend a lot as we move through the process.
And a quick one more add to that, Omar. I know that our housing department, working with our site managers, at times they'll coordinate transportation, whether they can, have, a van or something like that could be a possibility of a way to manage parking, particularly if we have a lot of clients who aren't driving, as Omar says. And if we, think that's going to be a reality, then we build that in. So there are just a variety of ways to try and meet the transportation needs of the people that are going to be living there.
So I see that your hand is still up, Jack. I want to know if that's just residual hand up or if you had a follow-up, so we can also check and see if there are other folks with questions.
I do have more questions, but I will gladly yield if somebody else has questions, and I can come back after everybody has a chance to speak.
All righty. For those that are just joining or have joined since we started talking, my name's Omar. I'm with the city of San Jose. I'm here with Jim Orpal, who's also another former deputy city manager, and Joe McCaffrey, our colleagues. You may recognize that Mayor Sam Liccardo has joined us for this session. We actually have a couple of colleagues from our housing department, Reagan Henninger, deputy director, and Kelly Hemphill, who are both also on this call. There was a brief presentation at the outset. So for Cora, Jessica, if interested, Christina, that's something that you can get on the website, which is posted in the chat thread. So I'm just going to, again, scan the room for questions. I see Brian's off mute, so go for it.
All right, we'll fire away. So let's help us do some of the math here, where if I understand there's 6-8 sites, proposed sites that the city's really looking into, let's say 100 units, people per location. So that comes out to the 600 to 800. And from what I understand, these are potential viable sites that you can access. Is that capacity in terms of the sites that the city, VTA, county has? Where does the other 4,000 people get housed after that? So what's above and beyond these sites that look like they're going to potentially occur here?
That's a really good, I think, time relevant question. My answer is going to be a bit mixed. So most importantly, is right now, more people enter homelessness than they enter homelessness at a rate faster than they exit in our region. So a big part of what we need to do, and I'll tell you why this is relevant to your question, is prevent more homelessness. We've got to get that number below 1 to 1 if we ultimately want the math to work, right? To your point, like kind of that way. I think the reason that matters is that number that I mentioned, at least 5,031 people, it's not a static number. There are people exiting homelessness, and our region has several thousand units that will ultimately come online that are permanent units. So I think part of what we've got is that mayor and council is taking a very big whack at the substantial number of folks who are unsheltered, and it's a step, and we've got to do more steps. We've got to do more prevention, and we've got to come up with ways to be more efficient about other options for people. I think that until we have some larger sort of systemic imbalances in our in what it costs to live here, but so it's hard to get to, well, what do we do about the next X thousand? I think that our next leadership are gonna have to really lean in on that, and we'll see where that goes. And then our job right now is to really push forward on these prevention aspects and those permanent solutions. Let me see if
Omar?
anybody else, oh, yeah.
Yeah, can I jump in on this one? Yeah, I think it's a super important question, Brian. So first, let me just say, with the units that we've built, these quick build units that we've gotten up and running in 3 different communities so far, although it's only a little more than 300 units, we already moved about 520 people out of homelessness in those units. And many of them have now moved on into permanent housing, or they've resolved their homelessness in other ways. Maybe we found a family member. So as you can imagine, because these are transitional, 6 to 12 months, they're also they're able to solve homelessness at a rate multiple the number of units, right? And our goal was to get 1,000 of these units under development or construction this year, because that will help us take a massive bite out of the homelessness challenge. What we had been doing all along up to this point for many years, and I say we, I mean city, county, many others, is building a lot of, and clearly not enough, but permanent supportive housing, permanent housing, which, as you probably know, is really expensive and very time consuming to build. Takes maybe 4 or 5 years to get a typical apartment construction project done. And it's typically in the Bay Area today about $800,000 per unit to build one of those units. Now, we're not going to stop doing that, but I think you understand the constraints. From a budgetary standpoint, from a time standpoint, we can't possibly respond nimbly enough to address the speed of this crisis. And so we're doing that stuff. We just, I think we got about $200 million went out in a notice for funding availability just in recent months, between, I guess, the 2 separate NOFAs, I think. Reagan, feel free to jump in and correct me on that number. But we've got other sources of funding that we're putting out there to build the permanent stuff as we're continuing to do this. But we recognize the most immediate crisis can be better addressed in the meantime by building these quick build units. So we have to be able to walk and chew gum. We're going to continue to build out that inventory. We just can't wait for that inventory to get built.
Mayor, if I could add something as well, we also have another program that you know, you and the council and the housing department pioneered by converting motels and hotels, maybe that were getting towards the end of their useful life, into interim housing, maybe some of them even to permanent housing. And then the state kind of adopted that as the Project Home Key program. And the city has about, in that same direction, we're tasked with trying to get up to 300 units. And we have approved in the pipeline, you know, some 280. So that's another strategy that our housing department, our city is deploying as well, to try and, you know, help and take another bite out of the size of our unsheltered situation.
Thanks, Jim. Jack, I see your hands up again.
Yes, thank you. Jim just mentioned or touched on a question that I was going to ask. One of the things that I always thought of that may be more cost effective than the tiny houses is abandoned commercial buildings that could be remodeled. And 50 years ago, I was in the Army in barrack style living. Seemed like you could house a lot of homeless people in a style like that in a maybe even a more cost effective way than individual houses. Has that been considered at all?
So I'm going to jump in on this one, Jack, and I think it gets a little bit nuanced, but there's a number of things to just bear in mind. So there is a substantial amount of what you're describing, the sort of dormitory, barrack style, you know, units for folks, and in not enough of any type, but certainly it exists. But there's a couple of pretty substantial challenges. We saw one borne out by the pandemic. It has happened with flu and other things, but when you have those kinds of spaces, you've got people all kind of mashed in together. And so, you know, airborne issues, travel, but it's not just the airborne issues that create challenges. there are people who feel unsafe, right? Maybe something gets stolen, maybe they get assaulted, would rather not be in those sort of congregate settings. And sometimes, right, like, you know, I snore. You can imagine if you were in a situation like that, it's like, man, if I'm really having a meltdown in the middle of the night, or having a real challenge rather, like maybe the person next to me is like, hey, I just want peace. Right. And so I think part of what we're charged with is trying to make sure that we create the types of solutions that people will use, because ultimately what we really want is people to have an option and actually use it and get off the street. And so I think that's just useful to say, having sat in more than a few encampments and had conversations with people when we were designing programs over my career, I can tell you that we really have to be thoughtful about that piece. But I will add, though, the notion of commercial partners, commercial land, frankly, that might have space on it. If you are connected to people who have that interest, right? It's something we're not so flush in terms of housing options that we can reject anything out of hand. So if there's something creative that we can take in, and landlords that are interested in that type of thing, especially as we have a change in work dynamics and how often folks in some places are going to work, I think that's useful for us to take in and work through our system. So thanks for that question, Jack.
Hey, Omar, can I just jump in with just a little bit more? I'm sorry. Everything you said is absolutely right. I just want to add a couple of thoughts. Jack, I know there's a lot of discussion about, hey, there's a lot of vacancy out there in commercial buildings. Why don't we just take them all and convert them? And of course, one challenge is they're held by private parties, right? And we respect private property in this country. And that requires us to actually buy it. And that's obviously a financial barrier. But it's actually super expensive to convert commercial buildings and offices, industrial buildings to residential, to make it safe for code, to get the plumbing and individual spaces, to get electrical, all those things. It's very, very expensive. And in many cases, just cheaper to build from the ground. So it's not an easy thing for us to do, unless, of course, as you describe, we're building what you call barracks or what we call congregate shelter, which is really what Omar just referred to. And in this city and cities throughout the West Coast, you're going to see a lot of empty spaces in congregate shelters, precisely for the reason Omar described. If you're unhoused, you often don't feel like you're safe there. You can't bring your dog, you can't bring your stuff, and it's the only stuff you got. And if we can't get people off the street to take the housing, it just doesn't do any good to build it.
Yeah.
Okay, and again, I have a couple more questions that I'll gladly yield if somebody else has questions that they'd like to ask at this time.
Yeah, Jack, let me go over to Brian and then we'll come back to you. Okay.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. Because I do have a piggyback on it, since we're talking about property, commercial lots, or whatever is there, just unused, privately owned land. Is I don't know all the logistics of these EIH lots, but do you actually have to go through the full process to put these? Like, what if there's a building and there's 2 acres of parking lot that's sitting right next to it? Can't you just use that 2 acres of parking lot and put in these tiny homes, and then knowing 12 months later they're probably going to get moved? Isn't there some kind of expedited process for that?
So Brian, I'm gonna let Jim take most of that. I will just say one thing to be mindful of is the utility runs and things of that sort on those parking lots aren't always super amenable to our needs. So if a commercial entity is like, you can use it for now, but you still got to pay to do all the runs, and then we got to turn around and move it to another location. So there can be some challenges. But I think from a process standpoint, I'll punt it over to Jim to kind of help explain that a little bit.
Yeah, we evaluate lots of different sites. The ones we've so far been successful on have been public properties that are owned by the city or other public agencies like Caltrans, the VTA. We talk with the county and Valley Water as well to see, do we have opportunities there? And typically those properties are kind of remnant properties from other projects. And typically we're not paying extra for the land or having to lease it or having to meet the requirements and expectations of a private property owner. We have negotiated with some, and they typically will say, okay, we're open to it, but you need to be off in 2 years. And I think Omar pointed out the utility infrastructure and the stuff that is just needs to be put in place to be able to have a residential community function, that can be pricey, and it may not be worth it if you're going to move off it in kind of very short order. So we're cognizant of kind of looking at the all-in costs and how long we're going to have it for, what we expect in that regard to see is the cost benefit there. And, if we're going to invest this, we want to try and get kind of the maximum utility out of it. So, we're kind of evaluating all of that. Jack, I may have missed the second part of your question. So if there's something else that I missed that you'd like me to address more specifically, I'd be happy to do that.
I think I see where you guys are coming from on the question I asked about commercial buildings. I have other questions. If we want to move on to other questions, that'd be fine.
Oh, sure. Yeah, go right ahead. Brian, did we miss? Hold on.
I'm
Jack.
sorry, that was Brian. Brian, you
Yeah,
asked the question. My apologies. Whoever
Yeah,
asked that
it's-
question, just let me know if there's more that you want.
Yeah,
Yeah.
please, let's keep running with that. Sorry, Jack. I think it's still on topic here with this old privately held piece of land that may be used for the interim housing. I guess I'm just not seeing the difference because it sounds like it's potentially a budgetary issue. But if truly going back to our original definition of the interim of what you're looking at doing now is only a 2, 3, 4 year project. What's the difference between the cost of that or this commercial building that has a 2 acre lot that can just be an interim 2, 3 year, assuming best case, it's something that the landowner is willing to just let the city kind of use and then get it back in 2 years when they need it and no additional cost other than setting it up.
Yeah,
Yes. Go ahead,
really
Dan.
good questions. So I think we've been in an evolving environment. When we did the first project, we really didn't have a proof of concept. It was the first time we were doing this, and the city was looking at a variety of ways of approaching what we were calling emergency or bridge housing. And the type of product or the approach that we took first off was bridge housing, where we had individual tiny sleeping cabins that didn't have bathrooms in them, didn't have showers in them. It's a community approach to it. So that did keep the cost down to some extent. And it was in fact built by Habitat for Humanity. And it was built with some volunteer labor. And it was built on a VTA site that we ultimately know will be needed for future BART construction. We were trying it out.
Can I ask, is this the Evans Lane? That's what I'm picturing that you're talking about. No, or is it something like that?
It is something like that, but the one that I'm referring to has kind of individual tiny sleeping cabins, about 110 square feet each. They're kind of independent, separate, and we have 40 of them on that particular site. It was the first one we did. It was the lowest cost one we've done, and Habitat for Humanity did it as a nonprofit, and they got volunteer labor, and we were able to bring it in at a very low unit cost. When we moved on to another set of them, the emergency interim housing sites that we did in 2020, Habitat for Humanity did some of them. They didn't use as much volunteer labor because those first couple of sites took a very long time to get done. The volunteer labor wasn't as consistent as professionally contracted labor, and it took quite a while to get those first set of projects done. Moving into emergency interim housing, we were in the pandemic. We were trying to do it as rapidly as possible. We hired contractors. We did it on a much more urgent basis with workers that were getting paid and that type of thing. And, in that process, we have bathrooms with the units and that type of thing. And then, would we move on to kind of private sites and how long might we have them? The construction for the tiny cabins, the bridge housing, the Mayberry site probably won't last as long as physically what the emergency interim housing could. That construction can certainly last 20 years. We recognize some sites we may not be able to be on that long, but a number of them are city owned, and we very easily could be. As the mayor said, we have legislation that allows us to do this, but it does sunset, but it's been extended once already, and we're working to get it extended again. So
So,
physically, they can probably last longer. So
Yeah.
in reality, we probably won't have ones that will just be a couple of years and then move on.
The-
It physically can last longer than that. And if it's going well and we still have the need, we'll probably continue to use it, which makes jumping from a private site to another private site not that easy, because to pick everything up and to move it and to start again, there is cost and lots of work associated with that. It would probably be preferable to stay on the site for a longer period of time than the shortest interim period that you could.
And before we go back to Jack, I just would also say, I think it was a point that the mayor made earlier. The actual, I mean, the crisis is one that demands a bit of urgency. And, you know, I'm a former land use and construction attorney, and dealing with folks haggling over their lease agreements and the amount of time it takes to get those things done sometimes. It just is a world of hurt. So like I said earlier, it's possible. And certainly, again, we're not in a position to be just ruling things out of hand, but that's one of the big challenges, Brian. So is this speed portion. Let's go back to Jack. He's been waiting a bit. Hold on, Jack. Mr. Mayor, did you want to chime in?
First, Omar, I didn't realize you're a recovering lawyer too. That's helpful knowledge.
Yeah.
But secondly, Brian, we've actually been trying to get a lot of big landowners to give us their parking lots for a few years, for example, for RV parking. And for the most part, I think, as you would expect, landowners aren't that enthusiastic about just letting you house a bunch of people on their parking lots, whether it's about liability or the revenue they could otherwise make or anything else. So there's not a large supply of property owners. In fact, so far N equals 0 of property owners who are super eager to allow us just to kind of move in on their parking lots.
Well, thanks for that additional clarity. Jack, you've been waiting. What's your question?
Yeah, my next few questions are legal questions that the Mercury News had articles on today. And one of the things it mentioned, the mayor wouldn't be inclined to build on a designated park, and they were going to check to see if Noble actually is a park. Do you have answers on that?
So the mayor can speak for himself since he's here, but what I will say is this. We just had a rules committee meeting today. There is additional analysis going on. While I did just mention being a lawyer, I'm not practicing as one in this capacity. So I don't want to pass judgment or prejudge what the internal evaluation will be. I think there was some interesting testimony today at the rules committee meeting, and I think we will find out. I think that our charge was over the next couple of weeks to try to get to a resolution on that particular question as it relates to Noble. So that's where I'd go with that for now, Jack.
And the second legal question that the Mercury News brought up was the 25-year agreement that was signed back in 2007 between 3 agencies. Could you comment on that at all?
Yeah, so this is another situation, Jack, where what I would say is the part of the process that our administration, legal and otherwise, the experts that do this work are going through is evaluating what those things sort of mean, their ongoing relevance to this conversation. That's part of what we had a conversation today about. Let's get these things dialed in and answered. So I don't think we're in a position yet to really comment until that has been done, which we again said today should happen the next couple of weeks.
Okay, and that's it for the legal stuff. So
That's good. Excellent.
And again, if Brian or somebody wants to jump back in, I have 2 or 3 more questions, but I'll gladly take turns.
Brian unmuted.
All right, I'll toss. Yeah. So I'd like to follow up on Sam, your last comment. I certainly get it. Anyone that the landowner doesn't want the liability associated with it. That's probably the most common concern that I've heard from the short list of people that I've talked to. It says, hey, why don't you donate some land for a couple of years? You're not using it.
Yeah.
What you know, in the act of, you know, goodwill, good faith, whatever you want to call it, what would they need in order to be okay with using it? What if you could insure that liability, or, you know,
Yeah.
I mean,
Indemnity provisions are common. I'm gonna, look, this is way beyond my legal experience. I'm a recovering criminal prosecutor, so I didn't do land like Omar did. The problem is, I think even if there's an indemnity from the city, any landowner would reasonably be concerned they would still get sued if they've got a deep pocket, because any good plaintiff attorney would naturally say, my client slipped and fell on your parking lot. And so we're going to sue everybody involved. That's the city and the landowner, everybody else. So, you know, we can do everything and everybody can do everything right. And the problem is there's still this risk. I think that is part of the concern, but Jim probably could speak more about whatever obstacles we've had in terms of securing sites.
I think you covered it. I think that, you know, that the site part is challenging. I think maybe where we've had our best partnerships with the private sector, Mary, you've led them with the likes of Peter and Susanna Powell, Sandhill Properties, where they see this great need in our community, and they have donated and paid for at 2 different sites the residential units. So they've donated millions of dollars to the city to stand up these sites. So we've had a couple of different sites where a good chunk of the cost was donated by community members that see a need to solve it. And so clearly they're in the private sector. Mayor, I think you've worked with John Sobrato as well.
Yeah.
So, you know, that maybe is a little bit easier approach. And I'm not trying to name names here, but there was a big corporation landowner in North San Jose that owns property that we worked with for a number of months early in the pandemic to try and get an emergency interim housing facility built on their property for an interim period of time. And just the complication of what the mayor talked about, liability, their interest in design review, how long it was going to be there. In the end, they just decided this isn't going to work for us. We're going to go in a different direction. And the city tries to be pretty flexible, tries to meet many of their needs, but in the end, they, I think, just kind of say, yeah, not too much for us. You know, and we've found more success on working on public sites, but as we're running out of them, you know, we're not past trying to do that, but we certainly need somebody who's going to be a little bit more flexible and really try and get to yes, as opposed to let's see if you can meet all of my requirements. We just need meeting more in the middle is what we kind of need.
It's a good point, the number of challenges that Jim brought up. And just as a reminder, as we talked about earlier, there's a real heavy need, even as we as city staff work very hard on addressing the crisis as it exists. There's a real heavy need for that prevention work to bring down the number of folks overall. I see a comment in the chat. I'm going to read that, but while I do, Jack, why don't you ask your question, and I'll see if there's I'll process Jessica's comment. So go ahead and ask your question.
I was going to make a comment. I've lived in the neighborhood for roughly 25 years, and over the years, I've seen really big, heavy equipment needing access to the ponds. Has that been considered as far as the layout of this and I've seen large amounts of heavy equipment needing access to that at the same time at various times over the last 25 years. Has that been considered?
Yeah, I think, Jack, I think that the answer to that question is that at some point, if the Noble site were to go into design and all of those kinds of things, our internal team would have extensive conversations with the various other users of that area, right? So it's not just there. The fire department has some pretty significant requirements for access and turn radius and that sort of thing. Obviously, our neighbors who are other property owners, again, this is not even necessarily specific to the Noble site, because as I mentioned at the start, the city council gave us direction that we could entertain alternative sites And so I would just say, as a longtime
Yeah.
community member, there may be others in your community that you're.
And you mentioned the fire department. I've even seen helicopters go in there with their water buckets to use those ponds for fighting fires.
Yeah, and
And,
so those are, I think, Jack, I think those are good points. I think I want to, so I think that's generally the answer, is that whatever site is involved, there will be a substantial amount of engagement as far as what folks need in the design process to make sure that it works for them. I do want to say, Jessica, really, I just want to note that we've got your comment, and our team is compiling all of the feedback, all the questions, all the answers, the comment that's in the chat thread about reusing vacant lots. The one thing I will mention, Jessica, about the notion of focusing on downtown or in one place or another, part of the reason that the city leadership has made a point of making this a shared responsibility across our region, our entire community, is that there's sort of twofold. One is we are one city, and so it's important that we sort of all recognize our ability to be sort of stewards and partners in solutions. And the other is, and this is a really practical one that's useful to know. I just joined the city of San Jose in June. I came from the county of San Diego, so I worked in a different branch of government, but it's the size of the state of Connecticut. And I can tell you from speaking to people who experience homelessness in downtown and people who experience homelessness in a rural community, those unhoused individuals are very reluctant to go from one place to the other. That's where their family often is. It's where they went to high school. I talked to several people saying, I went to high school here. I don't want to go live on the other side of town. So part of, back to a point that the mayor made earlier, we want to come up with solutions that people will use. Otherwise, we're not being good stewards of the taxpayers' dollars. So I think we're aware of your comment, and certainly many neighbors have expressed the challenges about the notion of these other spaces. So I appreciate that. I don't want to dismiss it. I just wanted to add some extra context for you. So we'll make sure to record that one. And then I'd like to go to Christina.
Yeah, so after listening to this conversation, I have a few questions. First off, I would love to hear in terms of whether or not the sites, especially the Noble site, is of interest for the unhoused to go to that location. Because for instance, in the case of Noble, it's actually quite far from any supermarkets, any place where you can get groceries. And so quite frankly, if you were to live there and you don't have a car, getting groceries would become a major part of someone's day. And I think the second question that's prompted, let me finish. Let me ask this before you respond.
Yeah, I just
So
didn't.
you've
I didn't
mentioned
know.
about,
I couldn't say that you weren't done. Sorry, go ahead.
so with regards to rural versus kind of urban unhoused people, what's the ratio in terms of the number of people there?
So I'm going to do this. The comment I made was about an entirely different community. I was just giving a context from a prior professional experience. I don't know offhand. I mentioned earlier that when we don't know an answer, we'll just own that, and then I'm happy to go get it and get back to you. Go to our county's continuum of care and get that information. But on the first question that you asked, it's actually a fairly timely question. When we got direction to go engage the community, what that means for us is the whole community. So in addition to holding all of these sessions that are on the website with people, most of whom so far have been housed, we are also organizing several sessions in encampments in the communities that we're talking about to ask that very question. So I couldn't tell you right now, but it's part of what we intend to find out for exactly the reason that you suggest. Now, I will tell you on the transportation issue, one of the ways that communities have addressed that from a service provision standpoint is there are several nonprofits that actually have shuttle service that just gets baked into the contract. So it isn't the case that people would necessarily have to spend a big chunk of their day getting the groceries, getting the doctor, getting the Caltrain, et cetera, just for clarity on that point. So Christina, I can share I put an email in the chat. If you want the answer to that ratio question, we'll dig it out. I'll put it in again. But that's the answer to the first question. And so I'm gonna go to Jack first, and then Christina, if you have another question, we can come back to you as well. So Jack?
And before I get to what may be my last question, I just want to make a comment. And the comment is that I think the Noble site is a terrible location. But having said that, I do appreciate the opportunity to have a polite conversation with all of you on it. So I thank you, even though I totally disagree with your decisions, I do thank you for this opportunity. So my last question that I know of is, this is interim. You mentioned 6 months to 12 months. If people are there, let's just say at the end of 12 months, and the prospect of them finding permanent housing or something doesn't look promising, what do you do with those people? Do you put them back on the street? What's the answer to that?
So the units haven't been, so nobody has been forced out by virtue of the length of stay. I'll have to check in with our team that holds that contract to find out if they're really struggling, what's the sort of next evolution. And so Jack, like I said, I'm happy to just get your information and double check, and it may vary from in terms of as this evolution of these emergency interim housing sites have done. So I'm happy to follow up with you if you're okay with that.
Yeah, that's fine. And that may be my last question for the night, so I might just be a spectator from this point, but I may pipe back in later. Thank you, guys.
Thank you. And I see that Reagan has raised her hand. She may actually just be answering that question.
Thanks, Omar. Reagan Henninger with the Housing Department. Thanks for your question, Jack. So returning any individual to the street is our last resort. We work with individuals very proactively on housing options. Each individual who stays in these communities is actively working with the case manager on a very individualized housing plan. And usually it's very specific to that individual and what's the best housing option for them. Sometimes it's reuniting with family. Sometimes that individual may have a rental subsidy voucher. It really just depends. So we really haven't seen a lot of people returning to the streets or exiting the program after X amount of time. Our request typically with our service providers is that the individual be actively working with the case manager on their housing plan. I don't know if Kelly wanted to add anything.
No, Reagan, you got this. Got it. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Jack. We're gonna go. I see Brian's got his hand up. Brian.
Yeah, so I'll say thanks, Jack. Teed up my next question. That was my question. The answers on that. If we can continue to run with that, because I think is kind of, as we talked about, the numbers. You know, if we get 1,000 homes, you still have another 4,000. What do you do with that? And one's exiting the program. I'm glad you're not forcing them out. It's just, I think, important to have a roof over their head. What happens after that? And I'm not sure there's an answer here yet, and that's okay. I'm just trying to see what's next, because I'm just trying to get momentum here, because I'm just a concerned citizen. I absolutely adore this EIH. I think it's a lane for the situation, and it's only partially the solution. We need to quadruple what you're doing, and how do we do that? What are the hurdles? Where do these people go? Because, you know, the permanent how happening fast enough, as we know. So what's the next? Let's just fast forward 12 months. Everything comes to fruition. Then what? There's still another 4,000 to 7,000 people that are out there.
So Brian, there's 50 answers to that question. I want to start with a couple baby steps though, just to, so first sort of nugget, right? is there are a number of options. Reagan mentioned a few: returning to relatives, actually getting their sort of, their actual permanent voucher to get into a place and get situated. Communities have explored things like shared housing models, where it's essentially like a roommate scenario for people who are experiencing homelessness, where they actually get matched with people, and then people of similar circumstances, and then they end up being able to stretch that dollar a little further. I want to reanimate and lift up a point that the mayor made earlier, that it's not quite a one-to-one when we think about these units, because people are there for some time and then they exit and other people come in. And so, 1,000 units doesn't just translate to 1,000 of the people who are on the streets. It's useful to know. But then also, I think sort of in that vein, part of the sort of mix of options. I just lost the train I was going with that. I apologize, Brian. So I can't remember where I was going to go with that last point, but I'll see if any of our colleagues wants to pop in.
I think I know where you're going, Omar. And I think it was, well, first, we are able to serve many more people than just the number of units would suggest with these units, but also we're scaling a lot of other options too. And the motel conversions that Jim referred to, again, that was something we pioneered here in San Jose, like back in 2016, and now we're able to get more resources and convert more motels. We're going to continue to try other innovative approaches in a lot of other ways. And, in the past, it was not with these, but with tiny homes. And we've experimented with a lot of other options too. And we're going to keep trying, because the truth is no city in the Western United States has fixed this. Nobody's really figured this out. I'd like to think we're muddling our way through a whole lot better than most, because we're so willing to try different approaches just out of necessity. But I can say this: after our last homeless count, for the first time in, I don't know, as anyone's memory, at least mine, we're able to finally stop the growth of unsheltered homeless in our community. And that was really because of what we've been doing here with these quick build housing communities. We actually have options for people to move off the street quickly. Obviously, we got a lot more work to do.
And Brian, the other thing, it's a good point that I think we've tried to reiterate, is like that notion of getting people. It is about reducing their trauma, about like reducing their suffering and improving our community. So these sort of quick build emergency settings really are valuable. The other thing I wanted to mention, it gets at the first little nugget of question you had, which was about like, well, what happens with people, and how do I evangelize the success of these? And I think you were kind of in that realm. It's like, hey, this seems like a good thing. We should be doing more of it. One of the things we're working on adding, we have heard in several of these sessions, is adding a little bit of a nugget to our website that helps people understand. Here's what the success rates, as an example, right? We know that for many of our sites, people are actually getting to move through and into permanent housing, but we want to really be in a place where we're giving you good, solid information in the aggregate level, because we can't really talk about people's individual cases. But so we're working on that one, and we'll be adding it. It's just the process with things go down a little bit in July and due to vacations and that sort. But I think we'll get there. It's a good piece of feedback.
Can I add to that, mostly from, I guess, for lack of a better term, just operationally on who the tenants are? If you look at the population of the unhoused, call them the 5,000, and this is just really back of the napkin math, half of those are pretty solid people, we'll call them. They're just down on their luck. They need some help. The other half, maybe they're a little bit deeper, a little bit of drug issues, and maybe a quarter of them are just the AOT issues and just out there. Thinking, okay, if you got 1,000 units and you got a 5,000 population, can you screen or filter the type of tenant that's going into this so that they have a higher likelihood of getting placed to permanent housing, whether it's with a family, they get that job where now they can support themselves? What are you doing an operation about who is going in there and the highest likelihood of getting out, so that now that 1,000 is leveraged 2 or 3-fold?
Yeah, Brian, I'm gonna take an initial swing at this, and then I'm gonna look over in Reagan's direction. I will start by saying, one of the things that we've got to think about is essentially, there's a couple of things. One, if you select a particular person who may be less vulnerable, you may be exacerbating the vulnerability and the difficulty of helping somebody else actually get into that very support. So there's a flip side to that coin of saying, well, if we could select for the people most likely to succeed, we'd be in this situation. Also, it's a challenging thing to try to peg even rough percentages to human beings and the conditions that they experience on the street. I can tell you from having personally sat with people who for months on end and said, I'm done. I don't want your help. I don't want, my mental illness, them speaking, my mental illness is so severe. I don't even want to talk to you. Now, there's way more people who are housed who have mental illness than are on the street. That there are way more people who are housed who have substance use issues than are on the street. The relationship is not as cut and dry as many, not you, but as many may suggest. What I do want to say though, as I pass over to Reagan to see if she has anything to add, is that we've got to be working on multiple prongs precisely because people are so individualized in their needs, and we want to be thoughtful about that. Reagan, is there anything you want to?
Thanks, Omar. I might just add that with the emergency interim housing sites that are already operating, we're prioritizing folks who live in encampments nearby that development to bring them inside to this community. And then we prioritize from other encampments as a second layer of prioritization, folks coming from other encampments in San Jose. And then we prioritize as a third layer referrals from some of our contracted service providers. For example, our service providers who operate our rental subsidy program. That's a program for people who have a 2-year rental subsidy along with supportive services for private market housing. And sometimes those folks just need a temporary place to stay while they search for their private market housing. But that being said, with those referrals, we have found that the people living at these interim housing sites have a wide range of abilities and disabilities. And so we are staffed on site with supportive services to serve people with a wide range of abilities and disabilities and functions, again, with the goal of moving them to wherever their permanent housing destination is, whether that's permanent supportive housing. It could even be a substance use treatment program. It could be a rental subsidy program, or even reuniting with family. So we haven't really taken the approach you mentioned, Brian, of prioritizing based on their abilities or their willingness or their function, if I'm understanding your point correctly. But I will say that is what our continuum of care does for permanent affordable housing, is we do prioritize based on an individual's vulnerability. So individuals who are the most vulnerable, whether that's a permanent disability, a physical disability, or a mental disability, often it's the people who are costing our emergency response systems the most, people who make frequent visits to emergency rooms, or people that PD and fire are responding to. Those are the folks that have a higher vulnerability and that are prioritized for our permanent supportive housing in our system as a whole.
So there's a couple things to mention as I look across for other potential hands raised. One is, Brian, this question has come up a lot about the screening, not just in terms of people's relative need, but potentially one subgroup or another. And one of the things that we let folks know is that there are pros and cons to that approach. And Reagan mentioned that one of the things we try to do is try to start in the community where that emergency interim home is going to go. And so one potential challenge is if you set a subgroup, like say we're only going to have a place for I don't know, people with blue hair, right? And then you go to the encampment and you say, hey, everybody, we've got a place for you, but only the ones with blue hair. And there's only 3 out of the 20 that have blue hair. Then you haven't helped the people in the community get into that site. And so I share that with you, not because we shouldn't consider those factors, but it just presents another challenge as we're evaluating. The other thing I want to just reiterate as we close in on the last few minutes is the importance. I put up earlier that our region has a community plan because I want folks to understand that there are strategies that these types of efforts are tied to, right? And so that's available for download, but also, and we've said this even in the most, not all of our meetings have been as delightful as this one in terms of our engagement, but at all of our meetings, we've said, look, we don't want this to be the end of the conversation. We all live in this community. And so you might decide as you're doing whatever else you do tomorrow or the next day, Jessica has put some useful items in the chat. Like we value that. We those of us who do this work spend a lot of time on this work. We're passionate about it, but we don't know everything and we don't have a crystal ball. And so it's helpful to us when you say, I do want to stay engaged. I want to help try to solve this problem. Like we don't have a monopoly on good ideas or on hard work. And so we're willing to take it wherever it comes. So Jim, were you gonna?
Yeah, just a quick comment.
Feels like you might be muted or something.
Can you hear me?
Just barely. It's
I'm sorry. Any better now? No?
maybe just talk real loud.
Okay, well, just when you capture, Jessica put 2 studies in the chat, and I'm not sure once the meeting ends how to capture them. One is a study from Vancouver about parking garage to permanent affordable that we want to get to Rachel in the housing department. And then I think the second one was in LA converting parking garage into some type of interim shelter housing as well. If we can capture those, we can certainly take a look and see if there's opportunity or applicability here in San Jose.
Yeah,
Just thank you, Jessica, for that.
Downloaded and saved. I think Jill is probably capturing both of those. And so, like I said, it's great to get the feedback. So again, we're about 5 minutes left. I'm kind of looking around to see if there are other comments, thoughts. I will say, the city council had 2 directions. One was go forward with a few sites, which meant start the design and all the various conversations that have to happen. And simultaneously, if you can find another alternative in any of the communities where these sites are, and it goes at the same pace, you can do those. And so we have really been encouraging folks to use the alternative site submittal form. We take that very seriously. It is not just an exercise. Jim and team, we are in the process of evaluating and we'll be sharing more as we figure that part out, what the right cadence for that is. But we have till August 15th to take in more. We've been doing it for a few weeks. And so I wanted to say that. Other questions or thoughts from the neighbors? Brian, looks like you've unmuted.
Yeah, like I said, I could run with this conversation for a while, but appreciate you taking the time here to enlighten us on this. So I guess 2 points, know that we're getting near the end here, is I don't think we have enough time. It's more of an operational expense, fiscal, I measure A, measure E. What is kind of the runway to operate these things? Let's just go back, best case scenario, you get 10 new sites, 1,000 homes. How long a runway do we have these things if they could run indefinitely? And then 2, are the biggest hurdles to getting these things approved? I certainly know that NIMBYs are an issue. What does the community need from you to help push this along?
So the short answer to the runway question was in this year's approved budget. Like we actually, that was just presented to the mayor and council. And so if I'm remembering this, and please, and anybody on our side of the fence, just whack me if I've got this wrong. But I think that I saw it in a 5-year forecast budget that was presented to council. So there's at least whether the revenues and projected revenues and expenses stay where they are over time is another question, but I think it's at least programmed. Jim, does that square with your and just correct me?
I think I got this question correct. I don't know that I heard all of it, but what we've done from a financial budgeting and funding standpoint, we've put together, and there's a full report on it, manager's budget addendum number 3, which is referenced in the staff report, Omar, that's on the website. So if you go to the staff report for June 21st, it summarizes what's in that manager's budget addendum. And really what it does, it looks at an almost 10-year forecast of source and use revenues and expenditures for this program. And in this budget, the 21-22 budget, the city council allocated $40 million additional dollars. And that's on top of about $20 million that was in the housing department fund balances. And out of that kind of $60 million pool of funding, our aim is to develop as many sites and units and beds that we possibly can out of this phase of development. That long-term source and use going on out to about fiscal year 29-30 also factors in the operations of the sites. When they come online, they have to be operated, they have to be maintained. And then there are additional monies allocated on an annual basis from Measure E, which is a city measure aimed to raise funding for a variety of different purposes to develop affordable housing, to develop quick build apartment communities, to support homeless services and programs, to have, better outcomes for people who are unsheltered and support them with services, et cetera. So there is kind of a long-term fund source and source and use balancing process that was heavily augmented this year. Reagan and her team in housing manage that, and different departments utilize that to deliver different parts of the program.
And Brian, you'll notice that Reagan and I both raced to put the link in the chat, so you've got it twice. To MBA.
Thank you. Yeah, and I popped it up. Yeah, I mean, if I can wade through that real quickly, it sounds like there's a runway of 8 to 10 years where they're set up and operated. If I understood you right, is that an oversimplified version?
That's I think that's accurate from the standpoint. That's how far out we projected. That's a pretty long projection as well. Typically, we operate in the 5-year forecast timeframe. This one went out about 10 years. So it's a pretty robust and long-term kind of forecast and source and use. So after that, we are and as we approach, I would imagine as the years go on, we're going to continue to push that forecast out and figure out how do we secure the ongoing sources to effectively manage it. And in addition, Reagan and her team are overseeing a study that is attempting to really develop the best practices to operate these communities and facilities so that they're maximally effective. They're getting the result of getting people permanently housed, and they're done in the most efficient way. So that is being done now, and we expect to issue kind of new competitive operating procurements in not this fiscal year, but the following fiscal year to try and get more effective. This is somewhat new to us, and we think there is more to be learned and more innovation, and that will be incorporated. And we would hope to see some level of savings that would help improve that financial condition. I'm sure there's going to be more demands that are going to come on that as well. So I'm not under any illusion that more demands and needs are going to come into the system, but that's part of what the housing department is doing. I don't mean to,
So
jump in, Reagan.
Can that be
you may have-
shared?
I apologize.
Do you have
Go
that
ahead.
report?
Go ahead.
That's right. Did you have anything written like that can be shared? That sounds like a really cool report. I don't know if Reagan, if anything's.
I think we're not quite there yet, right? Like that's in process.
Yeah, it's currently in process, but it will be shared
Yeah.
publicly. It will go to council's Neighborhood Services and Education Committee when it's complete, and then it will go to the full council for their input when it's complete, sometime this winter.
So we've reached the 6:30 mark. What I will say just in closing, thanks for joining in. There will be a couple more of these. Put the email in the chat if you want to keep reaching out. Jessica, there's a ton actually currently going on about trying to find opportunities for job training, either in current programs or even, I just was with the community college presidents for 2 local community colleges talking about career laddering for people who are unhoused, because frankly, in many cases that experience is actually a occupational qualification for being really good at helping other people. So we're really mindful of that, trying to create ways for there to be sustainable wage options for people. We could have a whole additional conversation about the proven aspects of what's called supportive employment, but we are out of time. So if you were enthralled and want to join back in, come to another session. I'm going to end the recording, bid everyone a farewell and a good night, and thanks for caring about what we're all trying to do together. Thanks so much.
Thank you.